The October light in Manhattan doesn't warm anything. It just arrives, pale and precise, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park Avenue penthouse like a blade wrapped in silk. Sloane Merritt stood at the kitchen counter in a gray cashmere sweater she hadn't chosen for the occasion. There was no occasion to dress for. There was only the envelope. It sat at the center of the marble island, cream-colored, already open, flanked by a Mont Blanc pen that wasn't hers. Callum's pen. He wasn't here. He never planned to be. His attorney had called at 7:15 to confirm the terms were unchanged. $8 million. The Hamptons cottage, Juniper on alternating weekends. A settlement, his attorney had said, for everyone's benefit. Sloane read the final page twice, not searching for an exit, just committing it to memory. She had learned, in 7 years of marriage to Callum Voss, that you should always know exactly what you agreed to. She hadn't always practiced that lesson well enough. She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She signed her name, clean, unhurried, the same signature she once used on architectural drawings before she stopped drawing. She pushed the envelope to the side and walked to the stove to make Juniper's oatmeal. What she didn't do was look at the second envelope, the one that had arrived yesterday, tucked behind a stack of mail she hadn't opened. Cream paper, Boston postmark. The return address read, Beckett and Associates, Estate Law. She didn't recognize the name. She left it on the counter. Juniper padded in at 7:40, clutching a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. She looked at the marble island, at the envelope, and at her mother. "Mama, are we having oatmeal?" "We are," Sloane said. "With the brown sugar." "With the brown sugar." Juniper climbed onto her stool and watched her mother stir the pot. The pen was gone. The envelope was gone. The kitchen looked like any other morning. Outside the window, Manhattan moved the way it always did, without asking anyone's permission. The school drop-off on East 82nd Street was the same as every Tuesday. Crossing guard in a yellow vest, minivans triple parked, someone's nanny arguing on the phone about a forgotten lunch. Juniper spotted her best friend Della through the gate and broke into a run without a proper goodbye. "Junie," Sloane started. The 5-year-old turned back just long enough to say, "Love you, Mama," then disappeared into the crowd of small backpacks. And Sloane stood at the gate until the orange door closed. She walked south on Lexington with no particular plan. The signed papers were already messengered to Callum's attorney. That chapter was sealed. What came next, she hadn't mapped yet. That was the honest truth. For the first time in 7 years, she had no idea what the next week looked like. Her phone rang. Boston area code, unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Merritt?" The voice was older, unhurried, the kind that belonged to a man who had delivered difficult news enough times to stop rushing it. "This is Harlan Beckett. I'm the estate attorney for your grandfather, Whitfield Merritt. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks." Sloane stopped walking. Someone behind her muttered and stepped around her. 3 weeks? She said. "Well, I never got any messages." "I called a number registered under your name, ending in 4471. That was her old number, the one Callum had suggested she change 18 months ago. "Too many spam calls," he'd said. "I'll have my assistant transfer everything over." Her stomach moved in a way she didn't name yet. "Your grandfather passed away 14 days ago," Harlan said. "He left specific instructions that you be contacted immediately. I need to meet with you in person, Ms. Merritt. Today, if possible. What I have to share cannot be done over the phone." Sloane looked down the length of Lexington Avenue, the yellow cabs, the coffee shops, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't care about her mourning. "Where?" she said. "Wherever you feel safe," he replied. She thought about that word, safe. When was the last time she'd chosen a room based on that? "The River Cafe," she said. 3 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. "And Ms. Merritt, don't tell anyone about this call. Not yet." She lowered the phone, kept walking. The city moved around her, indifferent and relentless, the way cities always do when something is about to change everything. The River Cafe in Brooklyn sat below the bridge with its windows facing Manhattan. A deliberate choice, Sloane had always thought. You could only see the skyline clearly from the other side of the river. Harlan Beckett arrived first. Gray suit, worn leather briefcase, the kind of man who'd earned stillness the hard way. He stood when she entered and did not offer pleasantries. They sat. He opened the briefcase and placed a bound folder on the table. "Your grandfather, Whitfield Merritt, founded Merritt Global in 1962, he began. "Energy, infrastructure, private equity. It grew quietly by design. He despised attention. By the time he passed, the total asset valuation across Merritt Global's holdings was approximately $1.4 trillion. Sloane's coffee sat untouched. "He had one surviving heir," Harlan continued. "You." She read the figure on the first page 3 times, then looked up. "Why did he cut off contact?" she asked. "I was 16. He just disappeared." "He didn't disappear. He stepped back." Harlan's voice was careful. "Your mother and he had a rupture. Painful, complicated. He was afraid that appearing in your life would force a choice between them. He chose distance over damage. It was the wrong choice. He knew that." "And the estate? It transfers to you in full." Harlan paused. "With one condition written into the will." He turned to page 4. She read it. Her grandfather's attorneys had inserted a protective clause designed decades ago to shield any heir from fortune hunters. The inheritance could only be activated in full if the primary heir was unmarried at the time of transfer. Sloane set the folder down. She had signed her divorce papers 9 hours ago. "That's convenient timing," she said quietly. Harlan looked at her without blinking. "That's what I need to discuss with you next." Callum Voss knew about this clause 2 years ago. "We have reason to believe the divorce was not spontaneous. On the timing, the structure of your settlement, we think it was engineered." The Manhattan skyline glittered through the window across the river. Beautiful, indifferent, enormous. "Show me everything," Sloane said. Page 19. Harlan slid the settlement agreement across the table, her copy, the one she'd signed that morning. He opened it to a page she had read and moved past, somewhere between the property clause and the child support annex. She read it now, with different eyes. Clause 19B. In the event that the non-corporate party receives an inheritance or asset transfer exceeding $500 million within 24 months following the execution of this agreement, 40% of said assets shall be directed into a jointly managed trust under the co-trusteeship of Callum E. Voss, designated for the long-term financial protection of the minor child Juniper A. Voss. The text was smaller than the surrounding clauses. 1 font size, barely noticeable between 2 pages of Hampton's property descriptions. Sloane sat very still. "Co-trusteeship," she said, "meaning Callum would effectively control nearly $600 billion, Harlan said. "Legally, quietly, in the name of your daughter." She looked at the clause again. Her signature was at the bottom of the page. Her actual, legal, voluntary signature. Who drafted this language? The firm of Whitaker and Crane. They represented you in the divorce proceedings. They were my lawyers. They were introduced to you by Callum's assistant, Harlan said, 18 months ago, when you mentioned you were thinking about updating your estate documents. Sloane placed the folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it. She had trusted those attorneys completely, shared every financial document she had, disclosed everything. She had been playing cards face up at a table where everyone else could see her hand. The window to contest this clause, Harlan said, is 30 days from signing. Today is day 1. You have 29 days remaining. And Callum knows I found out? Not yet. But his attorney at Whitaker and Crane will almost certainly report this meeting to him. I'd estimate you have hours, not days, before they recalibrate. Sloane looked out the window at the bridge. Steel cables in clean lines, every one of them under tension, every one of them holding. Then we move tonight, she said. Harlan placed a second folder on the table. Thinner, darker. Callum didn't design this, he said. Sloane looked up. His mother did. Marguerite Voss, 67, Boston-born, socially impenetrable, had discovered the existence of Whitfield Merritt's protective inheritance clause through a contact at a Boston estate law conference in 2021. One conversation, one careless disclosure from a junior attorney at a competing firm. That was all she needed. Within 6 months, Marguerite had identified Sloane. Within 8, she had introduced her to Callum at a Chicago architecture gala, an event that had not been accidental. Within a year, they were engaged. She built the marriage, Harlan said. She placed Rena Calloway inside Voss Capital to ensure Callum stayed focused on the plan and to create the appearance of infidelity when the time came, and giving Sloane a reason to file. Sloane said nothing for a long moment. 7 years. The way they'd met at that Chicago event. The conversation that felt like fate. The connection that felt earned. The slow erosion of her career, her friendships, her independence. All of it, curated, managed, designed by a woman who had read a legal brief and decided Sloane's entire life could be a vehicle. Rena was a tool, Sloane said finally. Yes. And Callum? Callum knew. Not all of it. Not from the beginning. But he knew enough and chose not to ask more questions. That was worse somehow. Not a man who'd been manipulated. A man who decided the mathematics worked and stopped asking about the human cost. Does Marguerite know the estate has transferred? She will by morning. She has contacts at the Boston probate court. Sloane looked at the folder with Marguerite Voss's name on it. The photo attached to the inside cover showed a silver-haired woman at a charity benefit, composed, expensively dressed. The kind of smile that had never needed to be genuine to be convincing. Then we have until morning, Sloane said. What do you need? Harlan asked. She thought for exactly 4 seconds. I need Ezra Thorne's number, she said. Harlan's expression shifted, just slightly. You know that name. I don't, she said, but you clearly do. And you brought it up in the original folder. Who is he? Harlan closed the folder. Someone your grandfather trusted more than anyone else alive, he said. And someone who has been watching over you from a distance. For 4 years. Ezra Thorne arrived at Harlan's Midtown office at 9 the following morning. Tall, unhurried, wearing a jacket that suggested he'd slept somewhere other than a hotel. He set a coffee on the conference table and looked at Sloane the way someone looks at a person they've thought about and never expected to actually meet. We've met before, she said. Chicago, 4 years ago. Architecture exhibition on Wabash. He sat down. You were arguing with a colleague about structural integrity in vertical gardens. You were right, by the way. She remembered the conversation, not his face. She'd been too focused on the argument. But the conversation, yes. You were there because of my grandfather. Your grandfather asked me to assess Callum Voss before the engagement became public. I spent 6 weeks reviewing his financial history, his business practices, his associates. Ezra paused. I told Whit the picture wasn't clean. There were patterns in Voss Capital's early acquisitions that suggested someone was feeding him confidential information from competing firms. And Whit didn't stop the marriage. He didn't want to override your choice. He said, and I'm quoting, "She's spent enough of her life having choices made for her. I won't be the next one." Ezra looked down briefly. I disagreed with that decision. For 4 years. I watched. I flagged anything that looked like escalation. When Rena Calloway joined Voss Capital, and I recognized the structure. I'd seen Marguerite use similar arrangements before in a Chicago deal in 2009. I tried 3 times to find a way to contact you directly. He stopped. Each time, something blocked the path. Sloane stared at him. 4 years of someone standing just outside the frame of her life, watching a disaster accumulate in slow motion. She felt 2 things simultaneously, grateful and furious. "You should have found a way," she said. "Yes," he said, without defense, without explanation, just the word, carrying the full weight of it. The room was quiet for a moment. "What can you do now?" she asked. "Quite a lot," he said, "if you'll let me." She studied him, the Chicago conference, the way he'd just taken the accountability without flinching. "Start talking," she said. They worked through the night. Harlan, Ezra, Sloane. 3 yellow legal pads, 2 laptops, cold coffee from a deli on 48th Street. By 3 in the morning, they had a plan. Move 1. Challenge Clause 19B through fraudulent inducement. Argue that the clause was deliberately obscured and inserted by attorneys with undisclosed conflicts of interest. Harlan would lead. Timeline. File within 72 hours. Move 2. Establish Sloane's legal standing as Merritt Global's incoming chair. Accelerate the estate transfer formalities before Marguerite could petition any court to delay them. Margaret Doone, the company's longtime CFO, was already on board. Move 3. Commission an independent forensic audit of Whitaker and Crane's billing records and communications with Callum's team. If they'd shared privileged client information, or that was disbarment territory. And it would invalidate any agreement they'd helped execute. Move 4. Ezra's contribution. Leverage his network to quietly surface the 2009 Chicago investigation that had been buried. Not through media, through the right ears at the SEC's regional office in Boston. Sloane listened to all of it, then said, "There's a 5th move they haven't thought of." Both men looked at her. "Callum doesn't know what I know, not yet. Which means if I meet with him, casual about Juniper's schedule, he'll behave like someone who still has the advantage." She picked up a pen. People make mistakes when they think they're winning. Harlan slid a document across the table. Your grandfather anticipated this possibility. In 2022, he had his team quietly acquire a minor stake in Voss Capital, under a holding company name. 3.2%, enough to give us formal standing to request internal communications records as a shareholder. Sloane read the document. Whit had been playing a longer game than anyone knew. "He was protecting me from inside their walls," she said quietly. "He tried everything he could think of," Harlan said. except the one thing he was too proud and too afraid to do. Walk through my door. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, then placed the pen down. Let's not waste what he built, she said. The document arrived at Harlan's office by courier at 8 a.m. on a Thursday. Filed the previous afternoon at the New York Family Court. Marguerite Voss, acting through her son's legal team, who had petitioned for a custody review hearing regarding Juniper. Attached was a psychiatric evaluation, professional letterhead, a Connecticut clinic dated 2 years prior, describing Sloane as having exhibited significant emotional dysregulation and impaired judgment under stress. The document was fabricated. Sloane had never visited that clinic, had never met the psychiatrist whose name appeared at the bottom. But it existed. It had a signature. It had a case number. Sloane was at school pickup when the notification came through on her phone. She stood at the gate, Juniper running toward her through the crowd of backpacks and voices, and read the court notice on her screen. They wanted to question Sloane's fitness as a primary parent. They wanted supervised visitation pending the hearing. They wanted Juniper. She put the phone in her pocket. She crouched down as Juniper reached her. Mama. Juniper pressed the stuffed rabbit into Sloane's hands. Mr. Hopscotch rode in my backpack all day, and he wasn't even scared. Very brave, Sloane said. Like you, Juniper said simply, already turning to walk. Sloane stood. She kept her face calm the way she'd learned to over 7 years. The particular composure of a woman who'd grown used to absorbing impact in front of an audience. She held Juniper's hand the entire walk home, listened to every word about Mr. Hopscotch's adventures and the art project involving too much glitter and the girl named Sage who could whistle with 2 fingers. She listened completely, the way you listen when you understand that this ordinary afternoon is the thing worth fighting for. After Juniper was in bed, Sloane called Harlan. The psychiatric document is forged, she said. I need you to find out who produced it and how fast. Already on it, he said. Ezra flagged it 6 hours ago. How did he? She stopped. Never mind. How do we kill it? We find the clinic director and get a formal denial on record. Then we file for sanctions against the attorney who submitted a fabricated medical document to a family court. And Juniper? She stays with you, Harlan said. I promise you that. Sloane stood at Juniper's bedroom door, watching the small rise and fall of her daughter's breathing. Make it fast, she said. The preliminary custody hearing was held in a wood-paneled room on the 8th floor of Manhattan Family Court. Quiet and fluorescent and utterly indifferent to the scale of what was happening inside it. Marguerite's attorneys presented the fabricated psychiatric document with the confidence of people who expected it to land unchallenged. Harlan's team immediately moved to contest its authenticity and requested a verification continuance. Judge Adira Fennick, sharp, experienced, the kind of judge who had heard every variety of strategic maneuvering, called for a brief procedural recess. During the recess, a court-appointed child advocate brought Juniper in from the waiting area to complete a routine identification protocol. Standard procedure: name, address, grade level. Juniper sat in the chair across from Judge Fennick with Mr. Hopscotch in her lap and looked around the room with the clear-eyed observation of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to edit herself. She looked at Marguerite Voss, seated at the far side of the room, and then she looked at the judge. I know her, Juniper said, pointing at Marguerite. She's Daddy's mommy. She talks on the phone a lot about my mama. She thought for a moment. She says Mama doesn't know things, but Mama knows everything. Mama builds gardens. The room was completely still. Judge Fennick looked at Juniper with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of what had just been offered. Not as testimony, but as something more unmanageable than testimony. Truth delivered without strategy. "Thank you, sweetheart," the judge said. Marguerite's lead attorney leaned toward his colleague and whispered something. Whatever he said made the other attorney put down his pen. Judge Fennick called the recess. Crack in the plan. After court, on the sidewalk outside, Harlan stood beside Sloane and said nothing for a moment. "She just did more in 30 seconds than we could have done in 3 hours, he finally said. "She wasn't trying to," Sloane said. "That's exactly why it worked." Sloane watched a taxi pull away from the curb. Juniper was back with the advocate, finishing a juice box, completely unbothered. She didn't protect me, Sloane thought. She just told the truth. That's what they never factor in. Sloane texted Callum on a Friday morning. "Can we meet?" Just about Junie's spring schedule. Nothing formal. He agreed immediately. That told her something. She chose a restaurant on West 56th, quiet enough for a real conversation, public enough that nothing could be misrepresented. She arrived first and placed her phone on the table, face down, the recording function already running. Callum arrived 10 minutes later in a navy suit, looking like a man who believed he was attending a routine meeting. He ordered sparkling water, made a comment about the weather. They talked about Juniper's spring program for 4 minutes. Sloane nodded, agreed, suggested a weekend exchange. Callum relaxed incrementally. She could see it in his shoulders. Then she shifted. "Callum," she said, her tone unchanged. "I've been going through the settlement paperwork again, just making sure I understand everything." "Of course." "Smooth, careful. Clause 19B, she said. A pause. Very small. Invisible if you weren't looking for it. "Standard protective language," he said. "For Juniper's financial security." "Who suggested it?" "Our attorneys drafted the full agreement jointly." "Which attorneys?" She tilted her head. "Because Whitaker and Crane were introduced to me by your office. I just want to make sure I have the timeline right." He adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "I don't recall the exact introduction." "Did you know about my grandfather's estate clause before we were married?" The moment. He looked at her, calculating the angle. Then, "Who told you about—" He stopped. He had answered the question without answering it. Sloane picked up her coffee cup and took a slow sip. "One more question. Was it your idea or your mother's?" The word mother arrived like a stone dropped into still water. His face changed, fractional, controlled, but changed. "Sloane, I'm not looking for a fight," she said, standing and placing her napkin on the table. "I just wanted to look at you while I asked." She walked out. The recording on her phone had captured 42 seconds of Callum Voss making 3 different mistakes. Outside on the street, the October wind was sharp and direct. She called Harlan. "We have the tape," she said. Harlan called it the triangle. Ezra called it the only way. Sloane called it Thursday. All 3 moves launched within 48 hours. Strike 1. Harlan. The recorded conversation was presented to the court overseeing the settlement challenge. Not as a confession, but as corroborating evidence that Clause 19B was inserted with foreknowledge of the Merritt inheritance. Combined with a formal complaint against Whitaker and Crane for undisclosed conflicts of interest, the clause was placed under emergency judicial review and temporarily frozen. Callum could not touch a dollar of the Merritt estate while the review was active. Strike 2. Ezra. Ezra activated 3 independent forensic accountants, people he had worked with on ESG due diligence projects across the country, to produce a clean, third-party audit of Merritt Global's most recent financials. The report was delivered to the SEC's Boston Regional Director within 36 hours. It showed 0 irregularities. The fabricated complaint Marguerite had filed with the SEC was formally dismissed as unsubstantiated. Strike 3. Victor Drayden. Victor, the D.C. investigative journalist Harlan had quietly engaged, published a carefully sourced piece in a major financial outlet. The subject: the 2009 Chicago investigation into insider trading involving a network connected to Voss Capital's earliest acquisitions. The piece named no current legal conclusions. It named Marguerite Voss as a person of interest who had never been formally questioned despite being central to the timeline. By Friday morning, the piece had been shared 1,700 times. By Friday afternoon, 2 of Voss Capital's largest limited partners had placed calls requesting meetings. At an emergency Voss Capital board meeting called to address the investor concern, a senior board member named Frederick Oates, who had attended enough strategy sessions to observe the invisible hand in the room, made a quiet statement that for 3 of Voss Capital's most significant deals over the past 5 years, the strategic architecture had originated not from Callum, but from conversations his wife had contributed to without receiving any formal acknowledgement. Callum did not contradict him. Frederick looked at the table and said, "We owe someone an apology we cannot deliver." It was Harlan who found it, an unmarked archival box at the back of the Boston office storage, labeled only with a year, 2019. Inside, beneath old correspondence and investment memos, was a manila envelope addressed to Ezra Thorne in Whitfield Merritt's handwriting. Harlan called Ezra. Ezra drove to Boston. He opened it alone, then brought it to Sloane that evening at the Brooklyn Heights rental she had moved to with Juniper. He didn't narrate it. He simply placed the letter on the kitchen table in front of her and stepped back. "Ezra," the letter began, "I'm writing this because I am running out of time and still too cowardly to write the letter that matters. The one to her. If you're reading this, the estate has transferred. She's on the other side of everything I built. I hope she doesn't hate me for the way I built it. What I want you to know is this. I watched her for 17 years. Every school she attended, every award she won, the architecture firm she joined out of graduate school. I read every project brief she published online. She was extraordinary. She would have been extraordinary regardless of the name she carried. I made one decision I will not apologize for, and 100 I would undo. The decision I stand by. Keeping her away from this money until she was strong enough to hold it without it bending her. What I would undo? Every year I spent in this office instead of on her doorstep. If you are in her life when she reads this, stay. She deserves someone who chooses her when there is nothing to gain from the choice." Sloane read it twice, set it down, looked at Ezra. He was watching her with an expression that had stopped trying to be neutral. "He asked you to stay," she said. "He did? Is that why you're here?" Ezra considered the question seriously. "No," he said. "That's why I showed up. Why I'm still here is different." She looked down at the letter again, at her grandfather's handwriting, careful, slightly cramped, the writing of a man who chose his words slowly. For the first time since October, she cried. Not loudly, not for long, just enough to let it be real. Ezra didn't move toward her. He didn't fill the silence with words. He just stayed. The federal letter arrived on a Tuesday, not at Harlan's office, at Sloane's new Brooklyn address, meaning someone had looked it up deliberately, specifically, to make sure she received it personally. It was a formal notification that the Department of Justice, in cooperation with the SEC, had received a complaint alleging that Sloane Merritt lacked the legal competency to serve as principal heir to a publicly adjacent holding company, based on the same fabricated psychiatric documentation Marguerite had submitted to family court. This was Marguerite's endgame, not to win, but to delay. A federal inquiry into a C-suite level appointment could freeze Merritt Global's leadership transition for 8 to 14 months. During that window, Marguerite planned to petition the estate court in Massachusetts with a parallel challenge, arguing that the inheritance clause required a competency review before full transfer. If it worked, Sloane would be locked out of her own inheritance, her grandfather's life's work, while lawyers argued over a document she had never signed, describing a condition she had never had, in a clinic she had never visited. Juniper was at the kitchen table doing a puzzle when Sloane read the letter, a wooden puzzle with farm animals. She kept placing the wrong pieces in the wrong spaces with total commitment. Sloane folded the letter, put it in her jacket pocket, sat down next to her daughter. "Mama, where does the cow go?" Juniper asked. "Right there." Sloane pointed. "The open space." Juniper tried it. The cow fit perfectly. "Oh," she said, delighted. Sloane looked at the puzzle, then all those pieces that seemed wrong until you stopped forcing them and looked at the actual shape of the space. She picked up her phone and sent a single message to Harlan, Ezra, and Victor Drayton simultaneously. They just made the mistake I was waiting for. The DOJ complaint requires them to authenticate the psychiatric document through official federal channels. We can subpoena the authentication, which means we can prove the forgery in federal court, not just family court. This is the opening. How fast can we move? The 3 replies came back within 4 minutes. All the same word, fast. The Massachusetts probate courtroom was smaller than the Manhattan one. Wood-paneled walls, old radiators that knocked when the heat came on. The particular institutional quiet of a room where serious things had been decided for a long time, and Judge Rosalind Okafor presided. She had read every filing submitted by both sides. Sloane's team had made sure of that by delivering organized, clearly indexed, brief packets 48 hours early. Marguerite's team had submitted theirs the morning of the hearing. The session lasted 4 hours. Harlan's team presented, in sequence, the forensic authentication report proving the psychiatric document was fabricated. A signed statement from the director of the Connecticut clinic confirming no patient record existed for Sloane Merritt. Email communications recovered through the shareholder Standing Wit had built, showing Marguerite's attorney coordinating with Whitaker and Crane as early as 22 months ago, and the recording of Callum's lunch conversation. Marguerite's attorneys objected to each piece of evidence with diminishing force. By the 3rd hour, their language had shifted from confident dismissal to procedural delay requests. Judge Okafor denied each one. Judgment. The petition to delay estate transfer is denied, Judge Okafor said. The evidence before this court indicates a coordinated effort to exploit procedural mechanisms to block a rightful inheritance, including the submission of a fabricated medical document, which this court will be forwarding to the appropriate bar associations and federal authorities for further review. She looked up from the bench. Ms. Merritt's standing as principal heir of Merritt Global is confirmed. The transfer proceeds as filed. Harlan touched Sloane's arm briefly. She did not move. She looked straight ahead at the bench until the judge had left the room. Then she exhaled, slow even, and for a few seconds said nothing. Ezra was in the gallery. He caught her eye. No words, just a nod, the kind that means I was here. I saw it. Outside the courthouse, the Boston wind came off the harbor cold and clean and direct. She called Juniper's after-school sitter. "Tell her I'll be home by 6, she said, "and that I'm bringing pizza." Marguerite Voss. The bar associations in New York and Massachusetts opened conduct reviews against 3 attorneys from Whitaker and Crane within 2 weeks of Judge Okafor's ruling. The fabricated psychiatric document became the center of a federal fraud investigation. Not a quiet civil matter, but a criminal referral. Marguerite herself was named as a person of interest, but she retained the most expensive defense attorney in Boston. He was very good. Good enough to keep her from a prison sentence. Not good enough to keep her name out of the federal court docket, which was public record, searchable, permanent. The social architecture she'd spent 40 years constructing, the charity boards, the dinner invitations, the carefully maintained reputation, didn't collapse loudly. It just stopped extending itself. Calls she expected to receive did not come. Her name was removed from 2 gala planning committees without announcement or explanation. That was the sentence that fit her. Not a cell. The absence of the room. Callum Voss. Voss Capital lost 4 limited partners in 6 weeks. The company's valuation contracted by 55%. Callum was not indicted. The evidence against him was corroborating, not direct. But every investment relationship he'd built rested on a reputation for integrity that had been publicly and permanently questioned. He sold his controlling stake to a private equity group in the spring. The company still existed. His name was no longer on the door. At the final custody determination, Judge Fennick awarded Sloane primary custody of Juniper, with Callum receiving a structured visitation schedule. He sat in the courtroom and looked at his daughter, who was drawing horses in the waiting area and didn't know the proceedings had concluded. The horse's legs were the wrong length. Juniper didn't care. She kept drawing. Rena Calloway. She relocated to Austin, started over at a smaller firm. No one in New York's financial PR world took her calls. Whether this was because of what she'd participated in, or simply because Voss Capital's collapse had tainted everything near it, was a distinction without a practical difference. She had been a tool. That hadn't protected her from the consequences of what she'd helped build. Merritt Global's first official shareholder meeting under Sloane's leadership was held at the Boston Four Seasons on a Wednesday in January. Gray sky, harbor wind, the particular cold of a New England winter that doesn't apologize for itself. Sloane arrived 12 minutes early. Black suit, her grandmother's pearl earrings, a legal pad under her arm. No prepared speech on a teleprompter, no media team in the lobby. The board convened at 9. 12 members, most of whom had worked under Whitfield Merritt for decades. They looked at her the way people look at the person who has been given something enormous and are waiting to see whether the weight will show. She opened her legal pad. For 40 minutes, she walked them through an 18-month plan. Energy infrastructure expansions in the Gulf Coast, a restructured partnership framework for the Pacific Northwest acquisition her grandfather had started, and a new division she was proposing. A sustainable urban development arm that would combine architectural design principles with energy-efficient construction. Something no one in the company had thought to connect before. Something she had been thinking about since graduate school. When she finished, there was a silence. Not uncomfortable. Evaluative. Frederick Oates, the senior board member who had spoken honestly at the Voss Capital emergency meeting, asked 3 pointed questions about capital allocation. She answered each one precisely, with numbers she had sourced from Margaret Doone, who was sitting in the 3rd row and did not react, which, Sloane had already learned, meant the numbers were right. The vote, 12-0, confirming her appointment. After the room cleared, Margaret Doone approached and placed something on the table. A pocket watch, gold-cased, old, the kind that hadn't been common for 50 years. Whit carried this every day, Margaret said. He told me once that he was saving it for the day Merritt Global had a leader who deserved it. She paused. I've been waiting a long time to put it down. Sloane lifted the watch, heavier than it looked, and a warmth from sitting in Margaret's hands. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, thank you for keeping it safe. The house in Brooklyn Heights had been chosen for 2 reasons. The light was good, and the back garden was completely destroyed. Sloane had seen the overgrown tangle of dead grass and collapsed trellises during the walkthrough and told the realtor she'd take it. The realtor had assumed she meant despite the garden. By March, Sloane had cleared it herself, most of it on weekends. Juniper helping by carrying small handfuls of debris to the pile with immense seriousness. The work was cold and slow and occasionally muddy and entirely satisfying in a way that Sloane hadn't felt about anything in years. She had forgotten that she knew how to make neglected things grow, that this was, in fact, one of the first things she had ever known. She ordered heirloom sunflower seeds from a catalog in February. Juniper helped her plant them along the east fence on the first Saturday of March, pressing each seed into the soil with 2 fingers before Sloane covered it over. Juniper had invented a small ceremony for this. She placed her palm on each seed and counted to 3 before the soil went on top. Sloane did not ask her to explain it. Ezra came over for dinner that Saturday evening. He brought groceries and cooked while Sloane reviewed a Merritt Global infrastructure brief at the kitchen table. Juniper sat between them, alternating between coloring a picture of a horse and demanding Ezra explain what he was making and why it smelled like that. After Juniper was asleep, they sat with coffee at the kitchen table, the brief closed, the coloring book still open on the counter. She interrogated me for 40 minutes about whether pasta has feelings, Ezra said. She does that, Sloane said. She's working something out philosophically. It'll pass. He smiled, looked at his cup. Then, I've been thinking about what Whit wrote, about choosing someone when there's nothing to gain. Sloane looked at him. I'm not choosing you because of the estate, he said. I want to be straightforward about that. I'm choosing you because you're the most clear-eyed person I've ever been in a room with, and because you don't need me to be anything other than honest. She didn't answer immediately. Start by being here on Tuesday, she said. I need help moving a bookshelf. He nodded. Tuesday. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The press briefing room at the Department of Energy was not glamorous. Government blue carpet, harsh overhead lighting, a podium with 2 American flags that kept shifting slightly in the ventilation draft. Sloane stood at the podium in a navy suit. No jewelry except her grandmother's earrings, which she now wore to every room where something important would be decided. And looked at the assembled audience. Federal agency representatives, environmental coalition heads, journalists from 3 major outlets, and 8 state infrastructure directors from across the Midwest. She spoke for 22 minutes about Merritt Global's new federal partnership, a renewable energy infrastructure initiative covering 12 states, 700 miles of updated grid capacity, and a projected $40 billion in investment over 20 years. The largest deal Merritt Global had ever signed. She had negotiated it personally. 14 months of work. She had read every technical brief, sat in rooms with engineers and economists and policy attorneys, and built the framework from the architecture principles she had once applied to buildings and now applied to systems. At Juniper's school in Brooklyn, the class was watching a live stream on the smart board. The teacher had set it up after explaining to the 2nd grade class that Juniper's mother was doing something important today. When the banner on the screen displayed Sloane Merritt, Chairman and CEO, Merritt Global, Juniper looked at the screen and then at her friend Della. "That's my mama," she said. Not loudly, not performing, just stating a fact about the world. Della nodded seriously and went back to watching. After the briefing, Harlan called, like your grandfather would have stood in the back of that room and not told anyone why he was smiling. He said. "I know," Sloane said. She looked out the window at the gray DC sky, the Washington Monument in the distance, white and direct and unchanged by weather. "Do you think he knew it would go this way?" she asked. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I think he hoped you would find a way he hadn't thought of yet. That was the bet he was making." She looked at the monument a moment longer. "Good bet," she said. The sunflowers came in June, taller than Juniper had imagined and taller than Sloane had honestly expected. She'd planted for comfort, not for height, and they'd exceeded the brief entirely. The first bloom appeared on a Tuesday morning. Sloane saw it from the kitchen window while making coffee and went outside in bare feet while the grass was still wet. She stood in front of it for a while. The yellow was very yellow. The center was very brown. It stood exactly straight in the early morning wind, which was warm finally, the way June eventually decides to be warm. Ezra arrived on Saturday morning, not unusual anymore. He and Sloane had settled into a rhythm over the months that felt like something she'd forgotten was possible. Normal, specific, honest. He brought a bag from the bakery on Atlantic Avenue. Juniper had requested the one with the almond paste. After breakfast, while Juniper watered the garden with a small green watering can she had selected herself from the hardware store on Court Street, Ezra stood beside Sloane at the back step. He reached into his jacket pocket. A ring, simple, clean, a thin gold band with one small stone, the kind that had been designed not to announce itself, but to last. "I am not doing this because your grandfather asked me to," he said. "He asked me to stay in your orbit, and I told him that wasn't my call to make." He looked at her. "This is my call. And what I'm saying is, I want to build things with you. Literal things, professional things, ridiculous things like trying to figure out what Juniper's horse drawings mean philosophically. I want to do that for a long time." Sloane looked at the ring, then at him. "You know I don't need rescuing," she said. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I'm asking." "Yes," she said. Juniper, who had been pretending not to listen for approximately 45 seconds, redropped her watering can and ran at both of them. She grabbed one of Sloane's hands and one of Ezra's and announced, with the authority of a person who has considered the matter thoroughly, "Now we're a 3. The wedding was small. Boston, in September, at a private garden that Merritt Global owned near the harbor. A property Sloane had quietly redesigned over the summer in the spaces between everything else. 40 guests, stone paths, late-blooming roses. The kind of ceremony where the details were chosen because they meant something rather than because they photographed well. Juniper was the flower girl. She had rehearsed dropping petals with great solemnity and then, during the actual event, forgot entirely and just walked down the aisle carrying them in a bunch, which was better. Harlan sat in the third row and did not try to hide that he was moved. Margaret Doone sat in the second row and was simply present, which, Sloane had come to understand, was Margaret's particular form of approval. Frederick Oates attended and shook Ezra's hand for a long time. No cameras, no coverage. The following Monday, a single line appeared in a Boston Business Journal's social column. Sloane Merritt, chairman of Merritt Global, married privately this weekend. That was all. In the drawer of Sloane's desk at the Boston office, the same desk her grandfather had used, refinished but otherwise unchanged. She kept 3 things: a photograph of Whitfield Merritt and her mother, 1988, standing under an oak tree, his expression serious and his eyes unmistakably glad. On the photograph taken in June in the Brooklyn Heights garden, Sloane and Ezra and Juniper, sunflowers in the background. Juniper caught mid-laugh at something off-camera. And a single folded piece of paper, the last page of the letter Whit had written to Ezra. The line that Sloane had carefully removed from the envelope and kept for herself. She deserves someone who chooses her when there is nothing to gain from the choice. She had been chosen once for what she didn't know she was worth. She had learned to choose herself. Everything else, the name, the company, the work, the love, had followed from that, not the other way around. So the story has finally come to a close. And hey, if you're still here right now, at this very moment, then something in this story touched your heart in a way that words can't quite explain. And I see you, and I really do. Because Sloane's journey wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about a woman who had been silent for so long that the world mistook her silence for weakness. But here's what they didn't understand, and what Marcus Aurelius said best. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Sloane didn't fight back with anger. She fought back with clarity, with patience, with the quiet, unshakable knowledge of who she was, even when no one else in the room believed it. And that's the real inheritance. Not the $1 trillion, not the company. It's the moment you stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never built for you. So if life has ever made you feel invisible, hold on. Your silence is not your defeat. It's just the chapter before the turn. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next one. This story, Divorce Papers Signed in Silence, is a work of original fiction, created purely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, including Sloane Merritt, Callum Voss, Marguerite Voss, Ezra Thorne, Juniper, and all others appearing in this narrative, are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental and unintentional. All company names, legal proceedings, financial figures, and institutions depicted in this story, including Merritt Global, Voss Capital, and all referenced organizations, are fictional constructs created solely to serve the narrative. They do not represent, reflect, or reference any real business entity or legal case. This content is a dramatic fictional narrative, not a documentary, news report, or factual account of any real events. No real legal advice, financial guidance, or medical information is intended or implied. We believe in honest, transparent storytelling, and we're proud to bring you original drama that entertains, inspires, and moves you. Thank you for watching.